Hey everybody, welcome back. This is the last lecture for the first week. We're going to be tackling infancy. I've been weirdly self-conscious about the lighting in the sense that I feel like me being super washed out from sitting in front of a window is probably got to hurt your eyes, like staring at it for 2 hours, assuming you're not just playing this in the background. So yeah, I've been trying to play with the light. If it is really bothering anybody, let me know. Otherwise, I'll assume this is fine. We can start talking about sensory information. What are sensory changes? So we can divide this into two different categories. There's sensation itself, and then there's perception. Sensation is just the process of taking in basic information with our receptors using our sense organs and our brain. So this would be the process of your eyes taking in light. This would be the process of your ears taking in vibrations that sorry, my dog's trying to get my sandwich. Yeah, the process of our ears taking in vibrations, your taste buds taking in chemicals. But just taking in this light, these vibrations, these chemicals doesn't really mean that much outside of being a person that can make sense of those things. And so when we talk about organizing and interpreting the sensory information, that's when we start talking about what we call perception. And it's really important to distinguish these two things because they're not necessarily the same thing. Obviously very intimately related, but perception more has to do with that idea of like making representations. If you remember, we talked about that in the first lecture. Perception is having some sort of like a mental understanding of these otherwise meaningless, these otherwise meaningless like physical entities, vibrations. And so when we talk about sensory development, one of the most prominent areas to focus on is vision. Vision is obviously very important for most people. We rely pretty heavily on vision as sort of relative to other animals. One of the most popular means of using vision to understand sort of what's going on under the hood developmentally is the preferential looking technique. This was established by a researcher named Fons, who really used this technique heavily. And it's just sort of a method that we can use to study visual attention within infants and how that might change over time. So it involves showing infants two different images simultaneously to see which one the infants might prefer over the other. There we go. Let me just, sorry, trying to get my pointer ready. And this is a technique notably that we can utilize behaviorally, right? We can pay attention to what object an infant is looking at and count the amount of time that the infant spends looking at it, and that sort of indexes some underlying sense of like the attention that the infant is putting towards it. But in more modern times, we can use more modern technology such as eye tracking programs that allow us to quantitatively determine exactly what an infant is looking at for how long they're looking at. And of course, we use these outside of development and infancy as well, but they're especially effective with infants because otherwise we might need to rely on inter-rater reliability, if you remember that from the first chapter, wherein we have two independent people watch a video of the infant and determine what they're looking at the exact time. This sort of skips out on that and gives us a nice objective measure of what an infant might be looking at a given time. How this usually works is they have the infant and the caregiver are each wearing a head-mounted eye tracker. The intersection of the purple lines shows where the viewer is looking, and the top panel indicates that the caregiver's gaze is focused on the infant's face. The lower panel indicates that the infant's gaze is focused on the green object, or kind of just above the green object. Notably, with this preferential looking technique, we have to be concerned about habituation, which is a decline in response to an object over repeated exposures. So if an infant has seen an object multiple times. If the novelty is kind of worn off, this technique might not be as effective, but we will get to habituation a little bit later when we get to learning. For now, we want to go on to visual acuity and color perception. So when we talk about visual acuity, what we're talking about is the sharpness of the visual discrimination, how efficacious, how able is an individual to discern one object from another. And we could talk about this in terms of both simple and complex patterns. There's also the case we can talk about contrast sensitivity, or the ability to detect differences in light and dark areas within one visual pattern. We usually will contrast high contrasting patterns versus low contrasting patterns. Again, similar to simple versus complex patterns. It just allows us to determine sort of at what developmental level is an infant. High contrasting patterns are generally much easier to discern. Low contrasting patterns where the difference between light and dark might not be as dramatic can be harder to discern. These all are related. The ability to discern these things not only depends upon cognitive development, but also physical or biological development as well. It's because we have cone cells that allow us, that are light sensitive and allow us to make these sort of discernments between contrasting areas. For infants, their acuity is actually extremely low. It's 20 over 120 right around the time of birth. I'm actually not too familiar. I know 20/20 vision is supposed to be like perfect. I'm not really familiar with vision ratings beyond that. But generally pretty low acuity, generally not a great ability at birth to discriminate between objects in space just based on vision alone. And it's also the case that the cones are not fully developed at that time. And we could think back to when we talked about sensations in the neonatal development. We talked about a lot of senses are sort of getting exercised and seem to be active, with the exception of vision. Again, there's not a lot of light that comes through into the womb. So infants don't really have much of an opportunity to exercise those sensory modalities. And so here we have examples of what researchers might use to determine an infant's visual acuity. You might notice that we have a plain gray paddle here, right here on the left. And then we've got these striped paddles that get progressively more complex, progressively harder to distinguish the difference in the stripes. And so what a researcher will do is present an infant with two paddles simultaneously, one of the grays and one of the stripes. We will usually start with the widest striped pattern. And if the infant can detect the contrast difference between the black and white stripes, the infant's gaze should be drawn toward the more complex, more interesting striped paddle. They will do this over successive trials. So if the infant can successfully determine the difference between this and this, we might move on to this paddle, and then this paddle, and then so on and so on, until an infant can no longer distinguish between the gray paddle and another striped paddle. At that point, that sort of is an indication of the infant's level of visual acuity. So moving on to color perception. Color perception actually appears a little bit late. It's around 2 months of age. That being said, the groundwork for color perception seems to exist long before color perception actually emerges. So infants do seem to have preferences for unique hues or unique hue combinations, even if they can't necessarily distinguish exactly what those hues are. There's also evidence that the brain is sort of hardwired to recognize color. There's preference of color categorization before language even seems to emerge. And there's also evidence that the brain is again, like sort of wired for this colored language even before birth. So here we have an example of an infant's visual acuity and how it might improve over time. Over here on the left is roughly what a 1-month-old might be expected to perceive if an individual is about 6 inches away from them. The infant's like relatively low level of visual acuity leads to some features of that image sort of popping out more. We can see anything that sort of has higher contrast, so like hairline, eyes, mouth, just these sort of like features are featured much more prominently than they might be when we have an image with better visual acuity. So as I mentioned, this is about a 1 month old, 1 month old's visual acuity. Over here on the right is about 8 months, I believe. And also notably, this is, as you might have guessed, about the same level of an adult visual acuity. And this example using a face and what an infant might see is not necessarily a mistake, just because talking faces are really important sources of information for infants, especially when we get into their own language development. When we look at infants who have not yet developed speech, we often see that their primary fixation is that on the eyes. But once they begin babbling and once they begin trying to develop speech of their own, we start to see that their fixation shifts away from the eyes to the mouth. This indicates that they are observing in some capacity or benefiting from watching the individual speak. This is also the case for bilingual infants or infants who are growing up in like a bilingual household, where we start to see more intense fixations on the mouths with so many different novel words, phrases being used. Okay, and then here we just have an example of visual scanning, just highlighting that at 1 month old, many individuals just pay attention to the broader details of the face, focusing on the contours, the edges. But at 2 months old, we start to pay more attention to the internal features of the face. Now, notably at 2 months old, we're not necessarily learning language yet. So there's not like a ton of fixation on the mouth, but like we'll start to see much more focus on the eyes, the nose, right around the mouth, generally just the internal details. So talking about the development of this basic hardware, and these basic abilities surrounding sensation and perception, we can also talk about skills related to sensation and perception. Because even though it might take some time to develop certain abilities, we're already hardwired for certain skills, I would say, surrounding sensation and perception. For example, we do have perceptual constancy, which is the ability to perceive objects as a constant size, shape, and color, despite the fact that that physical object might be moving around and appearing different. So you can imagine, you know, my hand looks very different now than it does when it's all the way back here, right? And we don't really need to develop this ability. We're generally able to understand that an object that's further away might like look smaller. That's we can separate that from what we would call object segregation, which is the ability to identify separate objects within a visual array. We generally do need some sort of experience for that, and culture also plays a big role. Another means of demonstrating the development of perceptual skills might be what we call perceptual narrowing, wherein a newborn might have a general bias for face-like stimuli, but still wouldn't be able to distinguish between like a face that's oriented incorrectly or a monkey or a human face. Around 6 months is when we start to understand the general structure of what a face should look like, and we have a general preference between like human and monkey faces. But the actual discrimination, the actual preference for human faces doesn't really emerge until right around 9 months. And so here we just have an example of a discrimination task that an infant might have trouble with. So an infant might not be able to tell on visual stimuli alone whether or not these two monkeys are different or whether or not these two individuals are different. So moving on, we can talk about the types of knowledge that an individual has. And related to visual perception, of course, is object knowledge. The book highlights a few different types of knowledge, but I'm going to focus primarily on object knowledge today. So importantly, a lot of the early work surrounding object knowledge comes from researchers basically trying to disprove Piaget's theories on development. Don't get me wrong, Piaget was extremely influential, but Piaget had this idea that object permanence or lack of object permanence, or the idea that infants sometimes have trouble interacting or acting as if an object exists as soon as it's out of sight, is related to the fact that infants have a difficult time or are not capable of creating complex representations of the outside world. Piaget was correct about object permanence, but was wrong about why that was the case. And importantly, there were some researchers that had a really clever paradigm to demonstrate that infants can generate complex representations of things that they could not see. So in this paradigm, we had an infant habituate to the idea that a screen would flip back and forth. So they created an expectation that this is how this screen behaves. They also then would place a box behind the screen. And so what the infant theoretically would believe is that when this screen flips up, it's going to hit the box and it's going to stop. This is exactly what you would expect. This is how objects interact. And so that would happen sometimes. But then on other events, the screen would flip up and the box, which was no longer in view, would disappear into the table. Now, infants would not expect a box to disappear into the table. Infants don't come innate with an idea of booby traps or like magic shows, you know? So notably, infants would look much longer at the impossible event, and researchers would take this as an indication that the infant had some sort of an expectation that was violated. We call these paradigms violation of expectancy paradigms or procedures, and they're a really effective means of determining whether or not an infant has created an expectation about the outside world and whether or not they can understand or perceive that that expectation has been violated in some way. We usually will look at these behaviorally. So again, I mentioned we can talk about the amount of time that somebody looked at it, but we can also talk about an individual's heart rate in response to that. And it's also the case that researchers have been using more modern methods like EEG in order to capture this. And just to wrap up the vision section, we have depth perception. I'm not going to go too deep into this. You guys should just be familiar with some of the definitions that we have on the screen right now. I do want to move on for the sake of time to hearing. So hearing is generally pretty advanced by the time of birth. There are some skills that we do need to develop after birth, notably auditory localization. That is just the process of identifying, or the ability to identify where in space a sound is coming from. This improves as the infant grows. Very related to auditory perception, of course, is music perception. Infants do seem to be born with some innate preferences for consonant sounds, sounds that go together, that are not clashing, as opposed to sounds that are clashing. It's the case that in some ways infants are born with like adult-like abilities when it comes to music. Others they need to develop. These include things like sensitivity to musical rhythm and melodic perception. And music very much is culturally dependent. Depends upon experience in order to cultivate and to build abilities in this like area. This idea of experience being necessary for some sort of a development is what we would call perceptual narrowing, or the idea that developmental changes depend upon experience in order to fine-tune the perceptual systems. And again, you know, music is one of these things. You could think about how different music is from culture to culture, and how different cultures have completely different systems of documenting music, of communicating music. This is not like music itself might be an innate human experience, but how we create music, listen to music, enjoy music is certainly not. We can also move on to talk about taste and smell. So taste and smell are both senses that we talked about being present even within the womb. Prenatal individuals do seem to demonstrate preferences for certain sweeter tastes. There are some studies suggesting that infants can actually recognize the smell of their mother's breast milk and differentiate that from the breast milk of other individuals. And it does seem to be the case that smell is a stronger driver of behavior in infants than is taste. We can also talk about the idea of touch. Touch is pretty important. It's a pretty important means by which infants learn about their environment. Oral exploration is pretty dominant early on. We can think about like pacifiers or sucking on thumbs or just like putting things in their mouths that infants shouldn't be putting in their mouths, like objects they find on the ground or whatever. This is a pretty big challenge for new parents. But around the age of 4 months, infants begin sort of using their hands, their feet to explore the properties of objects as well. Over time, as infants use their bodies more and more to explore their environment, they also develop stronger mental maps of their own bodies. They have more knowledge about their sort of physical limitations and better understanding of like the ways in which their bodies can move. And around 7 months, infants begin to process the locations at which other people are touched, using corresponding areas on their own somatosensory cortex. So, prior to 7 months, me touching my face might not yield much of a response from an infant, but at that point, the infant can imagine being touched on their face in the exact same area. We should talk about intermodal perception, which is the idea of combining information from 2 or more sensory systems. This is really important because very rarely do we ever get information from just one sensory area. If we think about listening to music, if you listen to music through loud headphones, not only do you get the auditory sensation of music, but you can oftentimes, like, depending upon how loud you're listening, actually feel the vibrations on your skin, right? If you're watching a movie, we don't just take in the visual information, we take in the auditory information as well. If you go to your favorite restaurant, it's not just about the smells, it's also about the taste, it's also about being in that aesthetic environment. Infants are generally able to make connections between certain modalities, but not necessarily all of them. So infants are able to make connections between visual and auditory stimuli. They're also able to make connections between speech sounds and facial movements. And they're also able to make connections between what they have seen and what they've felt. But generally, we might use various intermodal exercises in order to facilitate connections among the other different sensation modalities. And so for the sake of time, we are moving on to motor development and motor milestones. These tend to develop pretty quickly, but the timeline and the order in which they develop can vary tremendously from individuals and across different cultures. So most of the research that we do in developmental psychology is dependent upon studying Western, educated, industrialized, rich, democratic countries or cultures. I was trying to think for a moment what weird stood for again, but that's not necessarily representative of individuals across other cultures as well. So right here we have an example of caregivers in Mali who believe in exercising their infants to promote physical and motor development. And the maneuvers that they use actually wind up hastening their early motor skills. So they wind up walking and using their motor abilities much earlier than infants might in the Western world. Okay, and then so here we have the average age and range of ages at which North American infants typically achieve each of these developmental motor milestones. So you can see we're starting off with just being able to lift your head. We start seeing pulling up and standing with support somewhere right around between 5 and 10 months. We start to see walking with some sort of a support about 2 months after standing with support, and walking alone we typically won't see until about 11 months. So the views around motor development have changed quite a bit over the years. Early on, individuals, researchers thought that an infant's motor development was governed strictly by brain maturation, that it was just that the brain was not in a state to be able to facilitate motor movement. And as soon as the brain was, then motor development would progress and locomotion would occur. Currently, we understand that that's not necessarily the case. There's actually a confluence of different things that need to occur in order for motor development to be facilitated. So first, there are neural mechanisms that are at play, wherein an infant must have a brain that is sort of capable of coordinating this motor movement. But it's also the case that infants come out without necessarily having enough strength to support their upper bodies as they walk or as they crawl. There's also issues related to posture, control, and balance. These are both sensory, sort of a combination of strength and sensory concerns, and perceptual skills. There's also changes in the body's proportion. Again, you could keep in mind, like, the body is suspended in a fluid for 9 months. Once the body comes out and is subjected to gravity and the diet changes and the baby exercises, there are going to be significant proportion changes in how that body appears and how that body functions. And there's also the question of motivation. It's sort of to the species advantage. It seems, if you buy evolutionary psychology, which I don't always, but it could be seen as to the to the species advantage for the infant to sort of be helpless. That's been an argument that a lot of people have pushed forward. In a lot of other species, we see motor abilities the moment that they're born. A lot of deers will start walking within like a day, if not the same day that they're born. But on the other hand, when we have this infant that is completely helpless, more bonding occurs between the parents and the child. And so it might make sense that there's not immediate motivation for that child to walk, but that motivation must be developed as the infant spends time around other people who are exercising motor coordination. So as the infant's understanding of the world and experience with the world expands, so do their motor functions, their motor abilities. We can first talk about reaching. Reaching behavior enhances several aspects of an infant's understanding of the world around them. Initially, these can be pretty clumsy movements that aren't really efficacious. Right around 3 to 4 months is when an infant successfully is able to engage in reaching, and about 7 months is when reaching becomes stable enough that an infant could do so while sitting independently. This results in developing better visual development and motor development. An infant is able to indicate to a caregiver that they want a certain object or bring an object closer to them, so that they can explore it and understand it more. We can also talk about self-locomotion, or the ability to move oneself around in a specific environment. This was what we sort of targeted on the image a few slides ago, where we saw that an individual starts by first lifting their head, maybe crawling, standing with support, walking with support, and eventually walking by themselves. This is really important for being able to explore one's environment and exercise agency over one's own development. Again, another core theme that we talked about in the first lecture. Walking will improve with age and with experience and as these sort of muscles develop. We can talk about scale errors too. These are attempts by young children to perform an action on a miniature object that is impossible due to the large discrepancy in the relative sizes of the child and the object. These are really adorable. So here we have examples of 3 children making scale errors, treating a miniature object as if it were a much larger one. So we have right here, the girl on the left has fallen onto a toy slide that she was trying to go down. We also have a boy in the middle who is trying to get into a very small car. And we also have a boy on the right who is attempting to sit in a miniature chair. Yeah, I was gonna make an allusion to dogs not knowing their own size. Not quite the same thing. But still, we have this notion that children need the ability to explore their environment and develop experiences with these objects to better understand their size relative to their world around them. So that's going to do it for motor development. We are going to move on to learning. First, we can talk about habituation, since I've referenced it quite a few times now, but I haven't necessarily talked about exactly what habituation is. Pretty generally, we can think about habituation as a simple, highly adaptive form of learning that involves a decrease in response due to repeated or continued presentations of a certain stimulus or stimulations. It is notable that a lot of researchers tend to think of habituation ability as a indication of general cognitive ability. Those infants who habituate relatively quickly to a stimulus, or who take relatively short looks at a visual stimulus and show greater preferences for novelty, tend to have higher IQs when they are measured about 18 years later. It's the case that there's faster habituation in bilingual infants who do need to rapidly develop these intellectual abilities. We can also talk about statistical learning. So statistical learning is picking up information from your environment and detecting patterns within that information, such that you could guess the probability of it to occur given a certain situation. We can measure statistical learning abilities in infants using the paradigm similar to the expectation violation paradigm that we talked about earlier. We can measure this in the domains of music, in action, in speech. In all of these cases, we can present an infant with a certain note or a certain word or a certain behavior and look at their reactions when we put a violation following it, or something that they might not necessarily expect to follow it. And I know for some of you, learning, I'm sure that for some of you, habituation and statistical learning might be kind of newer concepts when it comes to talking about the methods with which people learn in a psychology class. We're going to talk about some methods of learning that are much more common. I'm sure you encountered these in your introduction to psychology class. First, we have classical conditioning. In classical conditioning, we have an unconditional stimulus. This is a stimulus that evokes a reflexive response. So we can think of maybe a baby seeing a bottle of milk. Well, actually, yeah, we have right here a baby seeing a bottle of milk. That might evoke an excited response from the baby. And that would be the unconditional response. So the baby sees the bottle of milk and we start seeing the baby wiggling its arms around or something like that. But let's imagine before the baby sees that bottle of milk gets warmed in one of those little expensive milk warmers that people have been buying nowadays. We can consider that the conditioned stimulus. Because once the baby sees the bottle go in that warmer, it knows it's about to be fed. So it starts getting excited. So even when we take away the unconditional stimulus, maybe the bottle of milk isn't there. If the baby sees that milk warmer, it might start getting excited, start thinking that, all right, it's feeding time. Really excited about this. And so classical conditioning sort of represents one means by which infants can learn about their environment or learn about associations in the world. We've talked about habituation. We've talked about statistical learning. We've talked about classical conditioning, but it's also the case that infants can learn a lot about their world through trial and error. So in this example, we can imagine a young infant learning pretty quickly that if they kick their legs in the air, they might bump their mobile, and the mobile might move in an interesting way. And that reinforces motor movement. I keep saying motor movement. I mean motor development. But yeah, so the infant has tried something, an unintended consequence occurs that is positive, that the infant likes, and that increases the likelihood that the infant is going to engage in that behavior again. We can also think about it in terms of joyous emotions. So an infant might laugh or might smile, and that elicits a positive response from the parents, who shower it with love and affection because they like looking at a smiling baby. And then the infant might again smile more often in the future. Infants have pretty intense motivation to sort of explore and master their environment. And as a result, like, instrumental learning winds up being a lot of the ways in which they learn about their environment. So we can also talk about observational learning or imitation learning. This is just learning through watching other people do something. We saw this a little bit, or seemed to see this maybe a little bit, when we talked about the development of speech. It seemed to be the case that newborn infants benefited from seeing their parents speak, or seeing faces speak, I should say, based on their attention to moving mouths. Unfortunately, this effect has been a little overstated in the past. A lot of the work looking at imitation learning, especially within monkeys, mirror neurons, if you've heard those sort of like buzzword things, have not really panned out. We haven't necessarily been able to replicate a lot of that research, but it's still like a little unclear. It's not a definitive no. It's just sort of in a maybe state. And so, to demonstrate that infants do have some ability to imitate or learn from humans, they have this paradigm wherein they show an 18-month-old infant, an individual trying to pull the end off of a dumbbell. We could see the effort right here, but unfortunately, the individual is not able to actually pull the end off the dumbbell. When they give this dumbbell to an 18-month-old infant who watched, they will also try to pull the end off the dumbbell. They do not see the same effect when the infant watches a machine unsuccessfully try to pull the end off of a dumbbell. And again, this seems to suggest that there is some representing of imitation, learning how to imitate individuals who are older than them. And so, just to put a nice bow on things, we can talk about two more forms of learning that are a little bit more complex, that demand aspects of all the other forms of learning that we've already talked about. First is rational learning. So this is considered the ability to use prior experiences to predict what will occur in the future. We could think about the fact that what we're essentially doing is we're not just observing physical relationships that are going on presently in the world and drawing associations between them. We're imagining objects that we may not have even encountered yet or observed yet, and trying to rationally determine what might occur in that future situation. So this is obviously a pretty complex form of learning that develops much later in an infant's developmental trajectory. This is going to involve not only classical conditioning and operant conditioning, but also statistical learning, probabilistic learning, in order for us to basically, determine what we think is most likely to occur in these future currently theoretical events. We can also talk about active learning. So active learning is, rather than just the imitating or the observing that we talked about previously, would be actually actively participating in the movement of objects within space, within the world. This can often be pretty driven by curiosity. So there's this pretty famous paradigm where after viewing a container dominated by a bunch of red ping balls, 8-month-olds are surprised when they observe that the experimenter extracted mostly white ping pong balls as opposed to red ping pong balls. This again suggests some sort of a sophisticated reasoning in how they understand this sort of toy. Usually when they observe this, they then start exploring this toy and trying to understand exactly why this would produce balls of these colors. focus a little bit on memory, but actually I think we're going to wind up covering that in a later section. So I think this is where we're going to call it for today. We moved through some of that a little bit quickly, but again, I'm trying to move on to the developmental stages where we can start talking about like early childhood, adolescence, all that stuff. So if anybody does have any questions, please let me know. Otherwise, I will see you guys next week.